Okay, so today's studio, I would argue, is actually a studio on the exercise of design. I know inheritance comes into play and you have to make some choices, but really, I think with the time that we have, I'd really like to have a discussion with you about the design of this studio and the choices. We may not actually have time to code it all up. I think that's okay. One of the points I was trying to make today, and hopefully I got across to you, is that if you spend some time thinking about the design, asking yourself some questions about the design of your program, then the implementation should just kind of naturally fall out of the design. So there's not a lot of decision making left to do, just coding to match the specification that you came up with. So I would really like to spend the time that we have left, the next half hour or so, just kind of asking ourselves some questions about this design, making sure we understand what this program needs to do, and coming up with a very solid design. If we do have some time, we can start trying to code some stuff up, but I'm not necessarily worried about trying to get to that part. So we're designing a quiz for this studio. If we look at the spec, and our quiz has a few different types of questions, so we can do multiple choice questions, checkbox questions, and true-false questions. And then the very first important things for us to consider, right, are what do these types of questions have in common and what makes them different? And we talked about this during the review session. The stuff that we have in common is going to go where? I know it says it on the next line, but humor me. It's going to go in a base class. And the stuff that it doesn't have in common, the stuff that's different, is going to go into the subclasses, right? I've already set up a diagram that has a base class with question and the three subclasses. And you know, if it wasn't clear from the way the studio was talking about these, there's going to be inheritance involved here. Yes, it's already recording. Yeah, thanks for checking. So if it wasn't clear from the way the studio was talking about these classes, right, there's going to be inheritance involved here. Let me see if I can scooch these in. I might be able to zoom in a little bit more so you can hopefully see this a little better with my wonderful projector. So I could even go ahead and start putting the inheritance indicators in here to reflect that I expect inheritance to be in use. But that's just part of the design process. Even after we recognize that inheritance is probably going to be in play here, there are still some very important design questions for us to consider. So let's return to those questions that the studio posed to us. What do these things have in common? What are some things that all of these question types have in common? The actual question, right? What am I asking you? There's a prompt, right? What else? There's answers, right? What do those answers look like? So for a multiple choice, what is that answer going to look like? It's probably going to be A, B, C, D, or something like that. It would be a common way of representing it. For a checkbox, that one's a little tricky because I've got, I could have multiple correct answers, right? So actually though, if I really wanted to, one way I could think about this is I could still use A, B, C, D, but I just might have multiple. I might have A, B, right, to indicate that both A and B are correct, or C, D to indicate that both C and D, right? So that's one way of doing it. Or does anybody have another alternative as to how they approach that one in terms of the answers? No? Okay. And then for true false, the answer is going to be obviously either true or false. You could have TF or whatever you want, right? So there's going to be a prompt. There's going to be some answers. But one thing that I hopefully have illustrated is that are the answers going to be the same? Like is the format, the structure of the answer is going to be the same, or is it going to be different? There are different types of answers. However, if I think about this from a coding perspective, everything that I just described could be described as what type? Multiple choice is A, B, C, D. That's a string. Checkbox is some combination of A's and B's and C's and D's. That's also a string. And then true and false, well, your brain might be screaming Boolean, 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 and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. I could also, if I wanted to, represent true, false as a string. So I could make the argument that while, yes, the answers themselves are slightly different in format, in terms of the content that I expect, at the end of the day, I could just treat them all as strings if I wanted to, right? There's some power in that. It lets me include this in the base class instead of the subclasses. If you disagree with anything that I've said, maybe you really want this to be a Boolean, right? You really want that answer to be a Boolean. Maybe for a checkbox, you don't want to have, multiple letters in the same string. Maybe you want to have an array or a list of answers that you can check individually. If that's an argument that you want to make, I am open. I am very open to those design choices, right? Those are, I think, perfectly valid design choices. You just have to understand how that's going to affect what we do here. Those would indicate then putting the answers not in the base class, but in the subclasses, since I'm treating them as different types. Does that make sense to everybody? Neither way is necessarily right or wrong. They just have their trade-offs. But we have to make a decision. We can't do it both ways. Well, actually, I guess we could, but we're going to make a decision. So we said that the prompt is something that we need. So prompt, which is probably going to be a string, and then if we want to put the answer in here as a string, we could do that as well, right? Does anybody have an issue with the access modifiers that I've used here? Yeah? Why? That's a question that maybe we don't even necessarily have to answer right now. I've marked them both as private, and maybe we can assume that that's good until we find a situation where we prove that it's not. Yeah, did you have a question?
I was just curious if we wanted to find an answer where each answer has more value and
a result. Oh, okay. So so you're saying each question is worth a certain number of points, and I can have point values given based on the correct answer? Is that kind of what we're...
Or any answer, yeah, that's the
We certainly could indicate a result here, right? What would the type of that be, I guess, would be a question that we'd have to consider. Maybe a double. If I'm talking about points, right, it could be a double. For some of these, though, like multiple choice, you either get it or you don't. True, false, you either get it or you don't. We could still represent that as points if we wanted to, right? That's still something that we could include, or we could just say it's either correct or it's not. If we wanted to be a bit more general about it, I could just have it as a Boolean. Either you got it right or you didn't. If we want to be a bit more fine-grained, then we could assign points. I don't have a problem with either option. As somebody who has, why did I type points? As somebody who has written his fair share of quizzes over the years, this is something that, actually grading is not something that I care a particularly large amount about, but my students seem to care about it quite a lot, so I have thought about it in that regard. Any other fields you included or wish to discuss before we move on to behaviors? Yes?
Well, I ended up keeping the answer in the question class, but I wanted it to be an array list.
An array list, okay.
To allow for the checkbox situation.
Okay.
And so I made it an array list of strings.
Uh-huh.
But then, and it was also symmetrical because then I had like an array list of possible answers, like, which we haven't done yet, but
So there's two things there that I kind of want to unpack. The second thing, the thing that you just said, right? The possible answers, the choices, is something that we need to discuss, and is not, we haven't actually chatted about that yet. So that's something that's, I think, important to take into account. But back to your point about the array list, I guess, so we could use an array. There's absolutely nothing wrong with an array list, but think about, with that design decision, what does it mean for all of our subclasses? So for a checkbox, I very clearly see why an array list might be preferable, because now I can just keep a list of all possible answers. But for true, false, and multiple choice, that array list is not really a list, right? It's just going to have one thing in it every time, which again is a design decision that you are certainly entitled to make. I personally. My personal preference would be to use a single string to accomplish this, but I don't have a problem with using an array list here either. Yeah.
I did just have a question about that though, because it got me wondering how you take the user input
Sure. Yeah. And that's an interesting question to think about, because we do need to consider the interactive piece of this, which is I'm going to expect the user to type in an answer, right? And when I type in an answer, what type is that going to be? It's going to be string. It's going to be a string. So at some point in time, I am taking a string and I am converting that into an array list, perhaps, right? In your situation. In my situation, by just saying that my answer is a string, there's no conversion necessary. I'm just taking whatever they type in, grabbing that as the answer, and then moving on with my day. Although in the case of a checkbox, there is the case that I'm going to have to unpack that at some point, right? There's multiple answers in there, and I'm going to have to figure out how to split that up into so that I can see if they are correct or not. Like, that's something that I'm going to have to do. So it's really just a matter of where you want to do that work. Do I want to do that work as they're typing stuff in, or do I want to do that work later when I'm checking answers? I'm going to have to do it at some point, right? So where do I want that work to happen? All right. I think this is a good list of fields. We also talked about, so the other thing that we talked about is the potential choices that are available for each answer. So I think that is an example of something that's different, correct? That's something that's different from question to question. So for multiple choice, what's that going to look like? What type would you associate with that? An int? Maybe a string? So I want to have my choices here. That's the name of the field that we're talking about. What's the type of that going to be? An array of strings? Could be. Could be an array of strings. Could be an array of ints. I would accept that as well. Could be an array of almost anything, really, as long as we have a way of distinguishing one choice from another. Somebody was asking me if they could use an array list here. Absolutely. No problem with using an array list here. That would work. No issues with that. But there's probably going to be some sort of a collection, either an array or an array list. Whether you use ints or strings doesn't really matter. For a checkbox, what's this one going to be? How do I specify the choices? Another array of strings? Yeah. It could look very similar, right? It could look very similar to the multiple choice. And then for true, false, the choices are, there's just two of them, and there's always two of them. There's always, do I need a variable for that? Do I need a variable for that? So I could make a choices variable here as well, but I don't need to. There's no need for me to do that. With so few choices to pick from, I'm totally okay with not having any additional fields for this to represent choices. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that at all. Okay, so there might not be any extra fields for this class, possibly. But I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of determining what fields are the same and what fields are different. Now we need to talk about our behaviors. So what behaviors do I expect a question to be able to, what things do I expect a question to be able to do? So display the actual question itself, right? Display the prompt. So there's probably going to be display prompt. Do I have any input parameters for this? Any output parameters for this? Maybe input? Well, so the question itself has this variable, right? This prompt variable, which I am using to be the question, you know, like how tall is the arch? You know, that's an example of a prompt. So if all I'm doing is displaying it, this method's actually probably fairly straightforward. It's probably just print the prompt on screen. So I don't see any parameters being necessary here. And as far as the return type goes, I don't necessarily see any return values here either. It's just display the prompt and move on with your day, right? What else does a question need to be able to do? I need to display the prompt. I need to Do what? So we need to check the answer. So evaluate answer. So what parameters might this method need? I'm sorry? The answer, whatever somebody typed in, right? I need the answer, which is probably, and the way that I've set this up is probably going to be a string. If you use a different type for your answers, then it's probably not going to be a string. It's probably going to be whatever you used as the type for your answer, right? Or actually, we talked about this too, if you have answer as an individual field of each of the subclasses, then do we want this here? Probably not. We probably want this, well, or maybe we do. I don't know. We might want this in the subclasses instead so that we can identify the individual types. There's something else, though, to consider with this. Evaluate the answer. Is this going to be the same? Like, is the way that I check to see if a multiple choice question is correct, is that the same as checking to see if a checkbox question is correct? Is that process the same? It's not, right? It's not. It's different. So while it is true that they share this behavior of being able to evaluate the answer, the process that they use to evaluate that answer is not the same. That is different. So we're kind of in this weird situation. Should this be in the base class or should this be in the subclass? Because let's say I keep it here. What's ultimately going to happen is I'm going to need to redo evaluate answer for checkboxes to make sure that it works. What's that called? Overriding. I'm going to have to override it. And I'm going to have to override it for multiple choice and maybe even true false as well, right? There's another way. There's another technique that we talked about earlier today that might be of interest to us here. Does anybody have any other ideas about this one? It's a term that lets us specify that we want this behavior to exist, but we aren't going to tell you how it works. We'll tell you how it works later. Abstract. Abstract. This could be a potential situation for an abstract method. I want all of my questions to be able to evaluate the answer, but I'm not going to tell you how to do that because that depends on the question itself. Does that make sense? So actually in UML we have a way of marking things as abstract. I don't know if it's going to let me do it because I was having problems with this before, but we put it in italics and it makes the whole box italics. This program is wonderful. I don't know how to make it just do this in italics. It's very frustrating to me. It just does the whole box every time. I just want this in italics. Come on, man. That's frustrating. Well, let me make a note. Let me just write it out. I'll just come out here and put abstract in front of it. So we know it's abstract. So I'm not going to tell you how to evaluate the answer. I'm just going to tell you that if you inherit from this class, you have to tell me how to evaluate it. You then have to tell me how to evaluate an answer, right? You have to have this behavior and tell me how it works. Yes?
So I was wondering if even, let's say that the method for evaluating would be the same across the cases, but I was wondering if since we have already designated that the choices are specific to subclasses, would that affect our ability to use evaluating answer in the base class?
It would. Yeah, it would. In fact, I think you've raised a very important point. The fact that choices are defined here in the subclasses means that even if I wanted to provide an answer here, it would not be able to use choices as part of its implementation. What could it do? It could check to see if they're equal, right? Does this string equal this string? That's one thing we could do in a simplest form. Is that useful to us though for multiple choice questions and checkbox questions? Maybe not. Or maybe it is. I don't know. It kind of depends on your implementation a little bit. It might actually work. You might be clever enough to find out a way to make that work. I think marking this abstract, though, is an interesting choice here. And actually, by marking this as abstract, something else that's interesting to consider is that I am now obligated to mark this class as abstract as well. The entire class has to be abstract. I cannot have an abstract method inside a non-abstract class. So what does that mean then? Oh, it lets me do that in italics, of course. If the class is abstract, what does that mean? I cannot create a question. I can create a multiple choice question or a checkbox question or a true-false question, but I cannot create an instance of the base class. And that sounds okay to me, actually. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I'm intending to create multiple choice questions and checkbox questions and true-false questions. I'm not intending to create just generic questions necessarily. If I wanted to, I could create another fill-in-the-blank style question, right, or something else along those lines to extend the functionality of the questions. I think marking this as abstract and having this method be abstract is actually a fairly good idea. In fact, I think there's one other abstract method that we could include here, one final piece of the puzzle that we might be missing. Let me bring this down. Bring this down. I want to put one more method in my base class. If you're taking a quiz, I'm going to show you what the question is. I'm going to show you something else, which is the what? The choices. I'm going to show you what the choices are, right? So here are your options, and then I'm going to allow you to make your selection, right? So I think we need another method for displaying the choices, and I think that this is another good candidate for an abstract method because I cannot tell you one way of displaying the choices. It depends on what the form of the choices are. For multiple choice and checkbox, it's probably just displaying the choices in the array. For true and false, it's probably just typing out the words true and false, right? Just putting in display choices. I forgot return types for these. What should the return type be for evaluate answer? There's a couple ways this could go. If we're storing things in the result, you could argue that I don't need a return type because I can just examine the result. If we don't have a result and we just want to know if we're right or not, I like Boolean as a possible return value here. I could see this being either Boolean or void. You could argue that maybe the return value should be the number of points. Maybe this should be a double. How many points did you get right on this problem? I would accept that as well, right? All possible answers, neither one necessarily correct or incorrect. It depends on how you view the problem and what your ultimate goals are. And so I'm trying to think if we have any other bases left uncovered here. I'm not sure that we do. As far as designing the questions goes, I'm pretty happy with this. I imagine this probably looks a little bit different than your design, and that's okay. That's okay. I actually think having different designs is a good thing. I think being aware of different designs is a good thing. Thinking about how you could do this differently is a good thing. Design problems are not problems that have right and wrong answers. I know some people really get a lot of comfort out of knowing that they found the right answer. Design problems don't work that way. It's about understanding the different options that you have and being able to pick the option that best suits your situation. And part of your situation includes your own comfort level with the concepts that you need to use, right? And your own personal preferences. That's part of the situation as well. The one other part of this design that's worth talking about, I think, real quick, there was one other class that it wanted us to, wrong one. One other class that it wanted you to do after implementing these classes, which, by the way, if I gave you this design, I think this is enough information for you to go off and create these classes and implement, and that would be a useful exercise. We don't have time to do that in 5 minutes, unfortunately. But we do have time to talk about the design of a quiz object. Specifically, what would the relationship of quiz be to the rest of our stuff? Has many, which is, where's the UML for that guy? I thought I saw it down here. Here it is, composition with the black diamond. A quiz has many questions. Has many questions. And so one way we could represent that is by having questions as an array list of question objects. There we go. An array list of question objects. And just like we did for the other ones, we'd want to think about behaviors. You know, we're running out of time, so I may not get a chance to get all these in. But what behaviors does a quiz have? It has the ability to add questions, has the ability to ask questions, right? Take a question from the pool, ask it to somebody, has the ability to take their response, so grab response from the user, and then check to see if that given response is correct or not. And then it's probably keeping a running total, right, of how many you got right, or what the point values are that you got right. And I can ask you, you know, what score did you get on this quiz, right? Stuff like that are what I would expect to see in the behaviors here. One other thing that I want to point out to you with the few minutes that I have remaining is that if you did decide to code this up, which again I very highly would recommend that you do as an exercise if you have the time to do it, you might discover along the way that some of the choices that we've made here actually turn out to be not so great, or maybe we made some mistakes, or maybe there's something that we just didn't think about, we didn't consider, and that's okay. That's another thing about design, is that you can spend lots of time on it, and I think that's all time well spent. But trying to think of every possible situation is very difficult, perhaps impossible in some situations. And so don't be afraid then to come back and update your design later should you find yourself in a situation that you didn't necessarily consider ahead of time. That's okay. That's all right. Update your design. Make sure your design remains accurate with how you've coded it up. Because the nice thing about this is if I do code this up and I want to show it to somebody else, actually I should be able to show them this design, and they should have a pretty good idea of how it works just from looking at this, not even looking at the code, right? If I showed you this and said, here's how my quiz program works, you can get a good idea for what it can and cannot do just from looking at this design, right? You don't need to see the code necessarily. This provides a pretty good description of what's available to us. So, I only got 1 minute left. Any last questions that I can answer before I get out of your way and wrap it up for the day? Yeah, what's up? Mm-hmm. It's whatever it says on Canvas. So I believe it's just chapter 8. Thursday, December, oh wait, that's Thursday. That's the wrong day. Chapter, does it have anything? There's nothing listed yet? Hasn't listed anything yet. All right, that's a question for Nick then, who is right over there. Hi, Nick. No, he's busy.
Is there a studio in chapter 8?
I'm pretty sure that there is. Yeah, I don't know why that's not up yet. I don't know if they are still working on it. I don't think that they are. I think it's probably ready. They just probably haven't gotten it converted up yet. So keep an eye out on Slack. I'll poke Nick and make sure that that gets posted up on Canvas, and then we'll notify everybody on Slack once that's done. Yeah. Don't think about that for now, though. For the next few days, you should be thinking about how much mashed potatoes and gravy you're going to be eating. That's what I'm going to be thinking about. So... and I guess assignment 2, I don't know, like, discuss assignment 2 with all your aunts and uncles around the table would be a good way to avoid the politics over Thanksgiving. Have a good holiday, everybody. Like I said, I won't be here next week, but I'll be back after that, so enjoy your holiday, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.